Journal. Over the course of her 23 years with the Edmonton Journal, Simons earned 2 national newspaper awards for her investigations and analysis of Alberta's troubled child welfare system. Her investigative work on Indigenous child welfare and the deaths of children in foster care also earned her recognition from the UNESCO Canadian Committee for World Press Freedom and from Journalists for Human Rights. Simons was part of 2 Edmonton Journal breaking news teams that won national newspaper awards for their coverage of the Fort McMurray wildfire and for their stories on the murder of 4 RCMP officers at Rochefort Bridge, Alberta. She earned 6 further national newspaper citations of merit for her columns and editorials on Alberta politics. Senator Simons also received recognition from the Alberta Centre for Civil Rights Research for her work championing LGBTQ rights, from the Canadian Bar Association for her writing on legal affairs, from the Canadian Mental Health Association for her columns on mental health care, and from the Edmonton Historical Board for her work as a popular historian and champion of heritage preservation. Paula Simons was appointed to the Senate of Canada on October 3, 2018 by Her Excellency, the Right Honorable Julie Payette, Governor General of Canada, on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen of Canada, Elizabeth II, on the recommendation of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. She sits as part of the Independent Senators Group Caucus. Senator Paula Simons.
Yay.
Thank you very much. I feel like my life is literally flashing before my eyes, which is not a great feeling at this time. So first of all, I wanted to thank you very much for doing this rather unusual meeting and for giving me a sense of purpose on this cold Friday morning. Thank you for getting me out of bed. I put on lipstick and everything. Now, of course, I had a whole presentation planned for you with slides, but it seems odd to like give a speech at you this way. So I thought what I might do is cover off a little bit less formally some of the points I had been intending to make. And then I really wanted to hear from you about how your community is coping with both the COVID-19 lockdown and with, you know, the repercussions of the collapsed oil prices. One of the things I've really been trying to do, since nobody really knows what a senator is supposed to be doing at a time like this, I don't have an actual practical thing to do. I've been doing call outs to community groups all over the province, speaking with mayors and chambers of commerce and business associations and cultural groups and not-for-profits to see how they're responding to this extraordinary moment in our history and to see how we can best pick up the pieces when this is all over. So if that makes some sense to you, I will do a little song and dance off the top about Senate and Senate reform and the role of the independent Senate. And then I really do want to put the onus back on you to share with me your stories and your concerns. Every day I get to take part in a parliamentarian's technical briefing with senior federal officials who are on the front lines of responding to the crisis. And I've been able to get some of the questions that people have asked me from Alberta asked of them, not always with very satisfactory answers, but so if that works for you guys. I will start off by talking about the year 1867. Now we think of the 1960s as a time of radical social change and revolution, but the 1860s were just as revolutionary a period in Western history. 1867 is the year that Karl Marx published Das Kapital. The 1860s were the year that the Russians freed the serfs and that the American Civil War led to freedom for American slaves. There were various monarchies overthrown, and in 1867, Britain passed the Far-Reaching Reform Act, which gave the vote to not to every man, but it was almost universal manhood suffrage. Women had to wait a little bit longer, a lot longer, But for men in England, it expanded the voter rolls to an extraordinary degree, and all kinds of people who hadn't had the vote before suddenly had the vote. So what else happened in 1867? You all have your microphones off. Who can put their hand up and tell me what else happened in 1867? Emery, what happened in 1867?
A country called Canada decided that they wanted to become a country, maybe?
That is right. So Canada forms as a nation. Now, there are a couple of things that are important to understand about 1867. When we say Canada, the mental picture we sum it up is all the pink stuff, sea to sea. That's not what Canada meant in 1867. Canada in 1867 was New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and a very tiny sliver of what is now Quebec and a very tiny sliver of what is now Ontario. So they formed together as a nation, a colony under the Crown in Great Britain. So you may wonder, why does Canada have a Senate? And there are two practical reasons that we ended up with an upper house. One of them was Canadian geopolitics. New Brunswick and Nova Scotia at that time had very vibrant economies, shipping and whaling economies, and they were worried that the more populous provinces of Quebec and Ontario would overwhelm them in confederation. And they said, well, it's not fair. They've got more people, but we've got bigger economies. Why should we carry them? Sounds familiar if reversed. And so one of the compromises of confederation was to create an upper house that would provide for regional representation. And so the deal was this: there would be 24 senators from Quebec, 24 senators from Ontario, 12 from Nova Scotia, and 12 from New Brunswick, so that the two maritime provinces would have 24, 24, 24. And there would be that kind of regional balance in the upper house. So that is one reason the Senate came into being. But there's another reason, and it goes back to what I was talking about 1867. And that is the fact that this was a time of social and cultural revolution. And the boffins who ran things in London were, I think it's fair to say, a little unnerved by the prospect of having Canada run around with just a House of Commons and no one to make sure that democracy didn't run off the rails, no one to make sure that the rabble didn't get too roused. And so in Britain, of course, they had a House of Lords where they had hereditary gentry who sat in the upper house and kept a bit of a break on what happened in the House of Commons, where the commoners were. Canada didn't have any hereditary lords or landed gentry, so the people who came up with our BNA Act and our unwritten constitution decided we should have House of Lords Light, which they named the Senate after the comparable body in ancient Rome. And since they didn't have any lords, they had to invent some. So mostly what they did was they put 72 rich old white men who were friends of the prime minister in the upper house. And you had to be rich. You had to have $4,000 worth of real property in your name. That's about $2 million worth of land. And you had to have another $4,000 in liquid assets. So you had to have a net worth of about $4 million to sit in the Senate in our terms. So this was something where you had to be a man of property, and you had to be a man, and perforce you had to be a Christian white man. So that was how our Senate started off, without really very many democratic credentials at all. It was there to provide a balance of power for Atlantic Canada, and it was there to make sure that that there would be rich old dudes who would be able to make sure that whatever happened in the House of Commons was not antithetical to the interests of rich old white dudes. And that is the model that we carry forward to 2020. So it's a bit problematic for lots of reasons. One, the intent to balance regional powers somehow got a little bit torqued over the years. When Alberta entered Confederation in 1905, we were given 6 senators. And given our population in 1905, that was probably not an unreasonable number of senators to have. Saskatchewan got 6, British Columbia got 6, and Manitoba got 6. And so the West got 24 senators, which is as many as Ontario and as many as Quebec and as many as the Atlantic region. But here's the problem over 152 years, Alberta's population has grown remarkably, as has British Columbia's, and the populations in the Atlantic have gone down. Hey, Kathy Heron's husband or child, that's cool. Just the mayor. So we have a situation now where Alberta has 6 senators, British Columbia has 6 senators, Prince Edward Island has 4 senators, Newfoundland has 6 senators. So it's a bit. We have kept with a system that radically disadvantages the West and radically overrepresents Atlantic Canada. Quebec has probably, the correct number of senators for its population. And Ontario, although we as Albertans hate to represent this, is also underrepresented in the Senate relative to how many people live in Ontario. So that is one legacy issue going forward. The other issue is that we have an upper house full of appointed people. And there have been tensions that have grown over the last 50 years about how we make a Senate that is a little bit more respectful of our democratic ethos. So there have been experiments with trying to elect senators. There have been experiments with trying to put term limits on senators. None of these has really worked out. And in 2013, Prime Minister Stephen Harper, as he was then, sought a reference to the Supreme Court of Canada and said, basically, how can I fix this? And he asked the Supreme Court 4 questions. He asked if he could have elected senators. He asked if he could set term limits for senators. He asked if he could eliminate the requirement that you own property. You still have to own $4,000 worth of real property, which is not quite as onerous in 2020 as it was in 1867, but nonetheless. Some people are renters, some people live on First Nations land. Not everybody owns real property. And then finally he asked, could I just abolish the whole darn thing? And the Supreme Court went away and thought, and it came back not very much later and said, no, basically you can't do any of those things. You can't have an elected Senate because it is part of the DNA of the BNA Act that the Senate be appointed to be a counterweight to an elected House of Commons. It doesn't make sense, said the Supreme Court, to have 2 elected houses, because then which one would defer to the other? If the Senate could veto legislation, the whole point of the Senate is that it is free of electoral politics. Its members are more independent of the election cycle. They don't have to be directly accountable to voters, and therefore they can take long view and support policies that may not be politically popular, but which are in the better interests of the nation. So the Supreme Court said, no elected Senate. Then term limits, which frankly to me actually seem reasonable if you set a 9 or 10-year term limit, but the Supreme Court also said no. They said part of the whole purpose of the Senate is that people are there, they have tenure, and therefore they have a political freedom to make decisions that they wouldn't have if they had to worry about what would happen at the end of their tenure. So a lot of people think we sit in the Senate for life. Maybe it just feels that way to people. The mandatory retirement age is 75, and it has been 75 since the days of Diefenbaker. Then the Supreme Court answered the question about owning land. And there the court was a little more optimistic. They said you could probably get rid of the land requirement, except that in Quebec, they have Quebec's the only province where the land is in a specific place. And so they said you'd have to negotiate with Quebec. And then everybody said, oh, that's too hard. But I still think we should abolish the land requirement. And then finally, there was the whole issue of abolishing the Senate outright, which of course is something that the Democrats have long supported. And the Supreme Court said, yes, you can abolish the Senate. Here are the ways in which you could do it. You could amend the Constitution, which would require in this instance, because this is such a radical change to the fabric of Confederation, you would require the unanimous consent of every single provincial legislature and the House of Commons and the Senate itself. That's a very high bar. And smaller provinces like Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick are not going to give up their Senate seats, I don't think. And Quebec isn't either, because Quebec gets a balance of power issue in the Senate as well. So at that point, I think Stephen Harper kind of threw up his hands and he just stopped appointing senators. I don't know if he thought they would eventually all die out, but he just stopped appointing them all together. And he did that in the expectation that he had another term coming, and then he didn't. And then boom, there was Prime Minister Trudeau, whom nobody had expected to win. Remember, he went into that election third place in the polls. People thought it was going to be a runoff between Harper and Mulcair. So suddenly there was Prime Minister Trudeau. And one of the promises he had made was that he would eliminate patronage appointments to the Senate entirely. And he would no longer appoint Liberal senators at all. All his Senate appointments would be independent. And so this was a pretty radical transformation of the way the Senate worked, because up until that moment, senators had been tied to parties. They had caucused with their counterparts in the House of Commons. They had been part of the government or part of the official opposition. And they had either been conservatives or liberals, and that was it. So Trudeau said no more Liberal senators and no more patronage appointments. And what he did instead was he set up an independent arm's length committee that was to go out and solicit applications to the Senate. So the way it works now is you don't have to wait for you don't have to write a big check to the Prime Minister. You don't have to be a party bag man. You don't have to be a good loyalist or a defeated parliamentarian. You apply online. You send in an essay about why you would make a good senator. I aced that part. You get 3 letters of reference, and you answer some skill testing questions. It's a fair bit of paperwork, but not that difficult. And you upload it to the Senate selection server, and then you wait to see what happens. And it is not an entirely perfect system, because clearly the people who are appointed to the Independent Arm's Length Committee, it could use slightly longer arms, in the sense that the people who are appointed tend to be people who are not radically out of alignment politically with the governing party. But nonetheless, what Prime Minister Trudeau has done is really quite radical. He has so far filled 52 Senate vacancies, either because they were seats that Prime Minister Harper had left open, or they were people who had retired. So he has appointed 52 senators. Not one of them has been a loyal, has been a Liberal branded senator. Some of them, a few of them have had ties to the Liberal Party, but most of them, like me, have been people who came from nonpartisan independent backgrounds. Or some of them actually were progressive conservatives. Not so much the Reform UCP kind of conservative, but Patty Labakan Benson, who was appointed the same day I was a progressive conservative Jim Prentice campaigner. So the idea was to appoint people who were not going to be Liberal lackeys, to be honest. So that's 52. Plus, there are other senators who had been in the Senate before, who have left the Conservative caucus to sit as independents. So right now, Alberta has not one single Conservative senator, because all 3 senators who were appointed as Conservatives are now sitting as independents. So including Doug Black and Scott Tanis, who ran for the Alberta Senate elections as Conservatives. So, I think that's interesting. So there's been quite a radical shift in the way the Senate works. The gamble for the Prime Minister is that if you appoint loyal party lackeys, they are much more likely to do what you as their party leader tell them. You now have a Senate where, because of floor crossings, there's supposed to be 105 senators. Right now, I think we're at 96 or 97, because we have some vacancies that haven't been filled. So of the roughly 100 senators, 75% of them are sitting as independents of one kind or another. I think there are 23 senators who are members of the Conservatives and 3 senators who have been chosen out of the independent group to function as government representatives in the Senate, because you still need someone to function as the government House leader and to put the legislation forward. So we are at this very radical point where there is, for 75% of senators, there is no party discipline. There is no one whipping us to vote in a particular way. We have complete independence to vote as we wish based on each individual issue. So that gives the individual senators more power in some ways than they've ever had before, because they don't just line up like good little ducklings and follow the mother duck into the chamber. Every time we vote, we have the quite daunting responsibility of making up our own minds how we're going to vote, with the one proviso that nobody wants to see a Senate that runs roughshod over the House of Commons. So we still pay deference to the elected House. We can't be, under the terms of the Constitution, we can't be striking down legislation willy-nilly. So we can vote down legislation if we believe it is unconstitutional or that it is extraordinarily prejudicial to our region, because it's our job to protect regional rights and also minority rights. So if a government came along one day and say wanted to, round up Muslims and put them in detention camps, or wanted to take away the right to same-sex marriage, the Senate would be perfectly within its rights, not just within its rights, but it would be its bounden duty to vote down such legislation, to defeat it. Where it gets trickier, you can see the black and white issues pretty clearly. When you get to issues that are a little bit more murky about what's unconstitutional and what isn't, then it's trickier to know. One of the best examples that I saw in the Senate right when I started, just a couple of weeks after I was appointed to the Senate, the government ordered postal workers who were engaging in rotating strikes back to work. They used their emergency powers. It was just before Christmas, you might recall, last year. And there was a lot of debate in the Senate, and I mean that both literally and sort of as a turn of phrase. There was a lot of debate in the Senate about whether it was constitutional to order striking workers back to work after just a short time of rotating strikes, and was that a violation of a constitutional right to free association and to strike. And there was a very good, thoughtful, heated debate in the Senate that went on all day. And in the end, the Senate voted to approve the back to work legislation, but it was a pretty close vote. So, people thought long and hard about whether that was constitutional. So the challenge we have now is if you appoint a whole bunch of very independent-minded people, smart people who were alpha dog type A personalities in their previous roles, whether they were judges or deputy ministers or university presidents or crabby journalists, and you tell them, go be independent. It's a little bit tricky for the government because people are being independent. And there are a lot of very big personalities and frankly, very big egos in that room. And although we're not appointing people anymore because they're rich, the way the appointment rules work, they tend to be prejudiced in favor of Hermione Granger type overachievers. So you have a lot of people in the Senate who were, I don't know how to put this, nerds in their previous lives. So you've got a lot of very big brains and sometimes not necessarily the balancing common sense. So you have a lot of academics, a lot of retired judges, a lot of retired, senior lawyers, at least 3 people who were senior deputy minister civil servants. So there's a certain weakness in this system, which is that it is biased towards that kind of intellectual meritocracy. So, we have changed the rules of what accounts for merit. It's not, we don't now use money as a proxy for saying you're a good person. Now we're using PhDs. There are a lot of PhDs in that room, and there are a lot of law degrees. And that's great. There are a lot of really, really, really smart people in there. With my master's degree from Stanford, I'm sort of like, one of the village idiots. But it's tricky because we have redefined the merit basis of how this all works. So we have some challenges going forward. None of this was set up for a crisis like the one we're seeing now. So, it's been very tough for a lot of us because a lot of people who are in the Senate are people who would have been on the front lines of a disaster response in their previous lives. And now and so, some of the senators have said, we'll volunteer to answer the phones at Service Canada. And Service Canada said, hey, thank you very much for your kind offer. Don't do that. So I feel like there's a lot of pent up frustration. It's not just me, but, in my previous life, I would have been out reporting on this. I would have been reporting back to people. There are people in the Senate who literally would have been leading the disaster response in their provinces where they were senior deputy ministers. And now we're all trying to figure out what we can do to be useful that doesn't get in the way of the important work of the House of Commons and the important work of the disaster response leaders in the government. We're trying to figure out what we can do to be more than merely decorative grace notes. And then we're trying to figure out, how we keep confidence of Canadians in our system as everything in this time of crisis feels like we're out of control. I mean, we in Alberta are being hit by a double whammy. Thank goodness, so far, our COVID numbers are relatively modest, especially in the Edmonton region. Calgary has been much harder hit than we have, and Toronto and Montreal have been much harder hit than Calgary and Edmonton. So thus far, I know it's boring to be home. Please stay home. If we all just if everybody in Canada just stayed home for 14 days, the virus would be not permanently vanquished, but it would be much defeated because the virus only exists as long as it has human hosts. So please do everything you possibly can, no matter how indispensable you think you are to the world, just stay home. It'll be okay. And the second part of what's happening here is, of course, the collapse in oil prices. Now, part of that is COVID related in the sense that planes aren't flying, cars aren't driving, and so there is a collapsed demand for oil around the world. But this has also got to do with a fight between Saudi Arabia and Russia, so that OPEC couldn't come to any kind of consensus on reducing output during this time of low demand. And as a result, we saw, earlier this week, the price of Western Canadian Select down below $4. It rallied yesterday because Donald Trump announced on Twitter that Saudi Arabia and Russia had a deal. Turns out, like many things that the President of the United States tweets, this may not be entirely true. So I would expect oil prices will fall again today and stay low Monday until, the President tells another fib, and then they'll go up again. I don't actually understand the psychology of stock trading, but my dad used to like to play the ponies. I guess it's a bit like that. So I have spent the last 3 weeks, talking to senior civil servants in Ottawa, talking to community leaders all across Alberta, hearing the individual circumstances that are going on in individual communities. So, in Jasper, the mayor of Jasper explained to me that Jasper has to pay rent for its entire town site to the federal government, and they owe the federal crown $600,000. Now, if you're the mayor of Jasper and all of your ratepayers are working in the tourism and hospitality sector, and everything is shut down, how is he going to find $600,000? So I have said that I would try and help with that. I spoke to the mayor of Banff subsequently. Banff only has to pay $550,000, but it's still a big bite. I've spoken to other regional mayors, to the mayor of Vegreville, where a bunch of their doctors went away over the March break and now can't get back. So Vegreville's down 3 or 4 physicians. to mayors that are in towns that are at the end of supply lines. The mayor of Grand Prairie is concerned about, what happens if supply chains go down and they can't get stuff delivered. In St. Albert, those aren't your problems. You have, an economy that's a little less exposed to oil. You're not going to have problems with supply chain, but there are going to be lots of other problems for small businesses, for leaseholders who had to pay their business rents this month with maybe no cash flow coming through. People trying to figure out what to do with their workers. Do they try to keep them on? Do they lay them off so that they can actually claim EI? If you lay off your workers, what happens when things power up again? And of course, what's frightening for all of us is that we have no idea when this ends. I had a Zoom meeting with the Innisfail Town Council yesterday, and they really wanted to try to pin me down to say, when does the government think this will end? And I said, I'm not a member of the government. They don't tell me those things. In the technical briefings, people keep asking, but there is no answer, because there is no answer. I'm quite sure that they have various models that show, if this happens, if that happens, but no one knows when this lockdown era ends, and no one knows how we pick up the pieces afterwards. So it is a very frightening time. It is a time when we're worried about our health and the health of our loved ones. And it is a time when we're worried about what happens to the economy. How, for people who are making payroll maybe they made payroll this month, how are they going to make payroll next month? For people who have been laid off and can claim EI, that's bad enough. But if you were a self-employed person or an independent contractor and you can't claim EI, it's even worse. And while the province and the federal government have set up emergency funds, they're difficult to access because of demand, and websites crash, people phone and stay online, stay on the line for an hour only to be cut off. So there's a great deal of frustration and there's a great deal of fear. I think it is a huge credit to us so far that things have remained pretty calm. Things, people are soldiering on, hunkering down. I think in this part of Alberta, we're good at hunkering down. I mean, it was minus 25 yesterday. I had no particular desire to go out. So, I have frozen pierogies and, and a lot of cabbage. So we do know how to deal short-term hunkering down. I have to tell you that I'm very worried about what happens 6 months out from here. So yeah, I'll bet Chimo production is way up. I have a freezer full of frozen peas and things for the zombie apocalypse. I have a lot of canned tomatoes. So that is me babbling on. I am just going to run and get a glass of water because I realized that was stupid. I didn't have one. You may now talk amongst yourselves. And when I come back from the bathroom with my water glass, I will be very happy to hear from you, answer questions, but also I just want to hear how you're doing in your businesses, in your community, with your families, and see what I can do to help. One moment. And I'm back with a mason jar of tap water. Woot.
So Paula, before you get going again, our meeting finishes at 8:30. So if we can have questions and things to you until about 8:20, is that okay?
That's lovely.
Thanks. So do we have questions or comments to Paula?
I have a comment, if I can speak. Can you hear me?
I can, Kim.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm an optometrist, And we are considered essential services, and we're doing emergency and urgent care. And we find ourselves in a unique predicament where the government's payout to contract employees is more than we can afford to pay our doctors now. So we've had about 16 of our 22 doctors say that they can't afford to provide emergency services at the rate that they're being paid, because the government payout is higher than what we're being paid. And then I find myself as an optometrist unable to, as a self-contracted optometrist, able to be paid in the same environment. So there's a category of essential workers here, and I'm sure dentists and other health professionals are in the same boat, where we can't afford to keep our businesses running and pay our optometrists, and we're losing critical care workers because of that situation, because it's better for them to stay at home and not get paid.
Yeah, no, it's really tough. I mean, there was a question on the technical briefing yesterday, similar from a somebody who had in their constituency a registered massage therapist who worked at a clinic full of physiotherapists and chiropractors who were deemed essential services, and she's an independent contractor, and if she quits, she's not eligible for anything. But she's, not many people are getting massage right now. So it's really tough. I mean, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, frankly, the first pass of this was imperfect, but that's a very legitimate question, and I don't know, because are your docs, their payment is set under AHS or under Alberta Health?
I know that doctors are private contractors to, I mean, we get some pay from the government, but that government pay is very small. The most of it is independent contracting.
Wow. Okay. I will ask about that, because that's a real challenge. All right. So I'm also getting questions.
Thank you very much.
All right. So Shauna has a question about domestic violence, which I know is a huge problem. And when you tell people to shelter at home, and home is not a safe place for them, I know that's a huge problem.
Right, and the other issue that we're having is we were actually slated to open on April 1st. So we're running into issues because funding models, we've been able to get $200,000 in 2 different grants from the provincial government just to help us get started in that bridge system. But most of our grants or that we need now are for operational funding. And it's sort of that bridging between how do we access dollars before we've had the ability to open our doors. We're busy trying to train staff. Obviously donations are not an option right now, because how do you do that in this economy? Yet we're trying to fund staff through training. And so we had heard that there were some federal funding specific for both homeless shelters and domestic violence shelters.
Yes.
And we're just sort of wondering if there's any untapped funds that we haven't had the opportunity to take advantage of yet.
I can have my office look into that. The other thing I should tell you is I was on the phone yesterday with the Edmonton Community Foundation, and they have opened up emergency funding for social agencies, including domestic violence shelters. I think that they service St. Albert as well, because your shelter's in St. Albert.
No, it's actually in Morinville, but we serve St. Albert, Morinville, Sturgeon County, that area there. So I will certainly let the executive director know that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak for the Edmonton Community Foundation. They have many calls on them right now, but they have just released an emergency big pot of money to try and help on the ground social agencies. And I don't know if their mandate includes Edmonton Metro, but I will also have my office look into what is available. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
Good morning. Thank you so much. This has been really valuable to us. I work at the Chamber of Commerce in St. Albert, and one of the frustrations from many of our businesses is Alberta encourages people to be entrepreneurs. So we have all these new businesses that have opened up in the last year who aren't eligible for any of the programs that are coming forward. They've tried to go to BDC to get a loan, and they don't have $50,000 worth of payroll last year because they only opened in November, and they can't get a loan at their bank. And the new program that's come out, they don't have history from last year. So yeah, we're hoping that something will come forward for these entrepreneurs, because they've already got high expenses from this past year, and they're not gonna find any relief at this point.
No, I mean, this is a disaster. I was going to say it's a huge challenge. That's not the right word for it. It's a frapping disaster for a lot of people. I mean, the mayor of Fort McMurray of Wood Buffalo, Don Scott, told me he thinks 75% of small businesses in his city will go out of business by the end of this. You know, Edmonton is looking at a 50%. You know, and I mean, the problem is each business circumstance is so different. It's one thing to say there should be a guaranteed basic income for every individual, but there can't be a guaranteed basic cash flow for, you know, for small businesses. It is heartbreaking, and I wish I knew what an answer was. Now, I see there was a question from Laszlo about rents. One of the challenges of being in a confederation instead of a country like, you know, like England or France, is that in Canada, as in the United States, the provinces have a tremendous amount of independence and power. And under the terms of the way Canada works, the federal government has no say over things like rents and whether that's commercial or residential rents. That's all provincial. So whatever Jason Kenney can be persuaded to do is different than what the federal government can do. What the federal government can do is lean on banks to be more generous. That's difficult. What the federal government has done is backstop banks and backstop individual deposits, which is in theory supposed to give the banks more flexibility. But, you know, I'm worried about charter banks. I'm worried about the Alberta Treasury branch, which is really exposed to the energy sector. So, you know, and banks are worried, frankly, that people are going and taking out money and putting it under their beds, which, you know, if we start creating runs on banks, it's going to be a disaster for everything. Yeah, no, I'm seeing Laszlo's question. I mean, even under the Federal Emergency Measures Act, they can't trespass on provincial jurisdiction. Can you imagine the premier's heads exploding? I mean, what the premiers want is money from the federal government. They don't want the federal government telling them what to do in their areas of jurisdiction. I know. Anybody else boggled by the new Doug Ford? The new and improved Doug Ford? Be like, where? I didn't have on my bingo card, Doug Ford becomes one of Canada's most respected political figures. So, all right, I'm seeing, is there a question here that I missed? Because you guys are all talking to each other now. Oh, you have international exchange students on the line. Wow. So hello to the students from Brazil, Belgium, Hungary, and Switzerland. I imagine that it is difficult and scary to be in a strange country and away from your families at a time like this. And I hope that your billeting families are loving you and being good to you. It must be, you know, my heart goes out to you, and my heart goes out to your parents in your homelands, because my daughter's 23 and she's away at university in Victoria, and I miss her desperately, even though I know she's as safe there as she would be anywhere. It's really tough to be away from family during a crisis like this. So all my love and best wishes to you. This is not the exchange you were expecting. All right, you have 1 more minute, I think. Oh, you're in your countries. All right. except for Bettina, who is in Edson. Well, I wish you all luck in the countries where you are. Hello, Bettina and Edson.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me, but
I can.
oh, awesome.
Sprichst du Deutsch oder Französisch?
Deutsch.
Deutsch, ja.
Ja.
Willkommen ins Kanada. Das hier ist nicht ein gutes Zeit, aber
Yeah, it's certainly not what I expected, but you know, my family in Switzerland is healthy and we have all this technology to stay in contact with them. So yeah, for me, it's going okay.
well, I'm so sorry for everyone who's caught up in this. And it's one of those things, I think I was talking earlier about how frustrated the senators are that they don't know what to do with themselves, but I suspect even the people who are on the very front lines, right? I mean, it's very difficult for anybody in government because the circumstances change every day, and it's really, it's difficult in small towns where there haven't been outbreaks. It can be really hard to convince people that they need to stay in. If you look out at Innisfail and say, well, nobody here has COVID-19, so why should I stay home? I was speaking with the mayor of Vegreville yesterday, who said it was almost perversely lucky for them because they had a prominent citizen in their community diagnosed right out the gate who'd been on vacation, and then everybody got the message, oh, this is real. So these are tough times. So support for students that won't have summer jobs. This was a question that came up in the technical briefing yesterday, because I think a lot of us thought initially that the CERB would be there for students who can't find jobs in the summer, and now it looks like it isn't. I think that's going to be a disaster, not just for people to get through the summer, but for a lot of students, those summer jobs are a big part of what they use to pay their tuition come the fall. And so I think there's going to be mounting pressure on the federal government to have some kind of support for summer students whose jobs, if they have them, may be cut short, or maybe they're not going to be able to start their summer job till July, or they may not have a summer job at all. So we're going to need some kind of mechanism, and a guaranteed basic income may be part of the model we need to move to.
So Paula, we do have one more question. Jill has her hand up.
Okay, Jill, go ahead. I don't see Jill.
Okay. Do we have any more questions for the Senator?
Jill, you can ask your question either online. Okay. Hopefully they will increase access to student loans. I think that would be a huge help to increase. I mean, they have already provided forgiveness of payments in the short term, but I think in the long term, we're going to need even more generous student loan programs with even more generous repayment plans, because, that is the one thing. We cannot cut our way out of this. All the people who are fretting about what this is doing to the debt and the deficit. I had an interesting meeting with the parliamentary budget officer this week, whose job it is to go through all federal things that cost money to see if they're working properly and what they cost. And his report is pretty grim, but when I got my personal briefing with him, I was cheered up because he said, the federal government was in good economic shape, and we can afford this bailout, and we can afford a stimulus package afterwards. And then maybe down the road when the economy is going again, we can have a harder look at government funding. But no level of government, whether that's municipal, provincial, or federal, is going to be able to cut their way out of this crisis. We are going to need stimulus spending, whether that's for infrastructure and big capital projects, or whether that's program funding, because we can't do a cold start to the engine of this economy. And in Alberta, where we're getting hammered on oil prices, we are going to need some really quick wins to get things up and percolating in a climate where we have a very short building season. We are going to need some really creative responses to what our economy is going to look like next November.
Okay, if there are no more questions for the Senate,